Today we are talking about the Iraq War and then a couple other events from the book. So starting off with the Iraq War here. Before we get into the events, the first thing to know about is who was Saddam Hussein. Okay, the war was really about him, about what he had done to Iraq and how the U.S. responded to his threats on his own people and to the world. So he was the dictator of Iraq from 1979 all the way until 2003, about 2.5 decades he was in power in Iraq. In 1980, he invaded Iran, which also just had their revolution. Okay, and this started the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted 8 years, from 1980 to 1988, and it resulted in nearly 1 million deaths. Now, during this war, he used what are called weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. There are 3 categories of WMDs: biological weapons, chemical weapons, and nuclear weapons. He used both biological and chemical weapons, and he was in the process of trying to develop a nuclear weapon. And he used these weapons against Iranians in this war, and also committed genocide against his own people during his time as dictator, both the Kurds in northern Iraq and also the Marsh Arabs in southern Iraq. Okay, thousands upon thousands of his own people were murdered by his hand, in addition to this very destructive war being caused by his invasion of Iran. He also invaded Kuwait in 1990. We talked about that a couple classes ago. This started the Persian Gulf War, something that also resulted in tens of thousands of deaths. Now, after 9/11, Hussein was suspected of 2 things. He was suspected of supporting Al-Qaeda, and he was also suspected of still possessing WMDs. Okay, he said that he had gotten rid of all of his weapons of mass destruction, but we did not believe that. We did not think he was trustworthy and thought he still had weapons of mass destruction and could use them against the U.S. All right, so all of those actions by Saddam Hussein and America's suspicions about him after 9/11 resulted in the U.S. invasion of Iraq. This started in March of 2003, and we had several goals. Okay, we had 4 major goals when we invaded Iraq. Number 1 was to topple Saddam Hussein's government, get him out of power, say enough is enough. You can't keep oppressing your people and threatening the world. Got to get him out of power. Number 2 was to replace that government with a democracy. Remember, that was the big problem France had during the French Revolution. They were great at getting rid of bad governments, but not so good at replacing them with something better. So he said we need to replace it with a democracy, something better to stabilize the region. Number 3, we wanted to find any potential weapons of mass destruction that he had. And number 4, fight all Al-Qaeda forces that may be hiding in Iraq. So this meant that for the rest of the 2000s, the U.S. fought a 2-front war in Afghanistan and Iraq. This is where a huge portion of our national budget went towards, and a lot of American soldiers fought in these 2 places. The reaction to this invasion: about 84% of Americans supported this invasion at the beginning. Remember, this is a year and a half after 9/11. Okay, we're still hurting. We want justice, and if there is a threat to our national security by this guy who has killed tens of thousands of his own people in the past, then we want to get him out of power. Okay, so at the beginning, 84% of Americans supported it, but most other countries actually did not. One exception was Britain. All right, the British Prime Minister, named Tony Blair, know that name, circle his name if you're taking notes here. He supported the Iraq invasion, and therefore British forces fought this war as allies with America. And this was called Operation Iraqi Freedom. And President George W. Bush said this was the closest friendship he ever made while president, was with the UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. Okay, they had a lot in common. Even though Bush was a conservative and Blair was a liberal, they found common ground and were able to fight this war together. Saddam Hussein, when American forces invaded Iraq, he ran, he went into hiding, while his army attempted to fight off the Americans. Now, eventually he was found just a few months after the invasion. He was found in December of the same year, 2003. He was hiding in a hole in the ground near a farmhouse near the town of Tikrit, his hometown. And if you see that picture there, that's when the U.S. soldiers found him, dragged him out of the hole that he was hiding in. Okay, so this is what he looked like after months of hiding, and we shaved his beard just to make sure that it was him, so we could confirm his identity there. He was interrogated. He was put on trial at a U.S. Army base run by Iraqis, and in December of 2006, he was executed by hanging because of all of his many, many crimes against humanity. The response of most Iraqi citizens in April of 2003, once U.S. forces entered Baghdad and toppled the government of Saddam Hussein, was of jubilation. Okay, they were very joyful. Remember, we invaded in March of 2003, and by April 2003, Saddam, he was out of Baghdad. His government had been toppled. The symbolic act you see in the top picture there, his statue was torn down, and most Iraqi citizens really took to the streets in joy and thanksgiving that their tyrant was now gone. You have a lot of Iraqis tearing down statues of Hussein, and they were greeting the American troops with tearful gratitude for freeing them from their oppressive dictator. And Bush declared that we had, quote, removed an ally of al-Qaeda, therefore making the world a more stable and peaceful place. However, the war continued for 8 more years. And that is a big reason for that is because once Saddam Hussein was removed, those who were loyal to him fought back. Okay, you had a lot of different groups that we called the insurgents. Okay, I know that's that term, a variety of anti-American Muslim groups that were either in Iraq to begin with or came to Iraq after the U.S. invasion to fight off the U.S. troops. So these groups included al-Qaeda, several other terrorist groups, okay, other groups who had either supported Hussein or groups that wanted Iraq to be an Islamic state instead of a democracy like we wanted, or simply those who did not want the U.S. involved in the affairs of Iraq, whether or not they supported Saddam Hussein. One group was Sunni Muslims. For example, Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Muslim, and he oppressed the Shia Muslims in his country. So when America invaded, the Shia Muslims were very happy, but the Sunni Muslims were not, okay? And a lot of them fought back as well. So similar to Vietnam, the enemy knew the terrain much better than the Americans did, and they fought for reasons that we really did not understand. So public support for the war declined in America over the next 8 years, from 2004 to 2011. And there are several reasons for this. Number one, the Iraq War lasted a long time. Thousands of Americans were killed. It cost billions of dollars every year. And Americans weren't really seeing any positive results of the invasion. Okay. Another reason why Americans started to protest against the war was because the U.S. failed to find any weapons of mass destruction. And remember, that had been one of our goals from the beginning. So a lot of people said, well, hey, if one of our goals wasn't even necessary, then maybe we shouldn't have invaded at all. So this led a lot of people to see the invasion of Iraq as a mistake. So in 2006, the war was not going well. You had about 3,000 Americans killed at that point, many others wounded and brought home, and it just was not going well. We had taken control of Baghdad, but then we had lost control of it and many major cities. And so President Bush had a decision to make. Either we could leave Iraq now, say it was a mistake, and leave and say basically declare defeat, or we could implement a new strategy to try to win this war. And President Bush chose the latter. He said we are going to fight until we win this war. So his new plan was called the Surge, and this was introduced in 2007. Bush increased our troop presence in Iraq by 20,000 soldiers. And a lot of people at first said, wait a minute, it's not going well now. A lot of Americans are dying, and you think the solution is more soldiers. So there was a lot of criticism of Bush for this decision, but it actually worked. It worked marvelously well. Having more soldiers in Iraq actually allowed the U.S. to take over a lot of urban areas, including Baghdad, that had been held by the insurgents for years. This was a huge success. It resulted in a decrease in fighting and overall deaths by the end of the summer of 2007. So the surge worked very well, and many people actually think it should have been employed sooner. I mean, if we had employed the surge 3 years earlier, the war could have been over much sooner. It's possible. Okay, it's possible. So the surge was very successful. Now, George W. Bush left office in 2009, and Barack Obama became president. And this affected the Iraq War a great deal. So after the surge in 2007, the war continued to improve for the U.S., and Iraq's future looked pretty bright. But still, many Americans believe that we should leave Iraq immediately, since so many believe that it was a mistake to begin with, and we should not be there anymore. So upon becoming president, Obama vowed to end the war and remove our troops by the end of his first term. By the end of his first 4 years, he said, I will remove all U.S. troops from Iraq. And this he did. On December 15th, 2011, President Obama removed the last of the U.S. combat troops from Iraq, and this officially ended the Iraq War. And at first, this seemed to be a really good thing. I remember being really happy about this. The war's over. It looked like we had won a victory, okay, because we had killed Saddam Hussein, right? We had established a government that was semi-functioning, I guess, although we weren't sure how secure it was. We had fought countless Al-Qaeda members and weakened them, and we didn't find any WMDs, okay, so we didn't have to worry about that anymore. So at first, this seemed to be a really good thing, but since the U.S. had not completed its goal of replacing Hussein's former government with a stable, strong democracy, the American departure actually had a very negative effect because it left a power vacuum. A power vacuum is when whoever is in power leaves and then there's no one in charge, so a bunch of different groups try to seize that power. And unfortunately, the group that seized power in this region once America left was ISIS. All right, it was filled by this newly formed radical Islamic terrorist group called ISIS, who we will learn much more about next class. All right, so the Iraq War, okay, a lot of people say it was a mistake. Other people say it was a good thing that we fought, that we did good work there. I do want to hear your opinion. Our third item for today is for you to fill out a discussion board, okay, write a paragraph with your answer as to whether or not the Iraq War was a mistake or if it was a good thing that we invaded. One thing I always think of when trying to wrestle with that question myself is I go back to a speech that President Bush gave in January of 2002, in which he said that we have an axis of evil in the world. And the three countries he classified in the axis of evil were Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Today, Iran and North Korea are still very hostile enemies to the United States, but Iraq is not. Okay, they are no longer an evil country. They no longer have an evil regime, and they are no longer a threat to the world. So definitely a lot of mistakes were made in Iraq, but there were certainly good outcomes of it as well. Okay, so I want you to turn to page 607 in your book. Okay, and I want you to look at the chart. Okay, the chart right here under confronting terrorism. All right, so countries with the largest military budgets as of 2012. So if you look at those countries right there, and you could probably guess from all of the wars we have talked about with the United States and how much money we have, the U.S. has by far the largest military in the world, by far the most powerful. Not only that, but just look at our military budget. This is of 2012. It's bigger now. Okay, but the U.S. spent $656 billion on the military in 2012. Now, I want you to write this in the margin. Not only is that more than any other country, but it's more than the next 25 highest countries combined. All right, that is just astounding how much money we spend on defense. Okay, now it's up to you to kind of formulate your opinion as to whether that's a good thing that we spend that much. Okay, maybe it makes us safer, maybe it increases the debt. Definitely ways to weigh that information. Okay, this next section on genocide and human rights. Just got a couple pages to go through today. The global community said never again to genocide after having seen the horrors of the Holocaust. However, sadly, genocides did continue to occur. Remember, we talked about the killing fields with the Khmer Rouge, with Pol Pot in Cambodia in the 1970s, okay, where 2 million people were killed, about a third of the Cambodian population. So sadly, genocide has continued to happen now and then in human history. Another genocide that took place, this time in the 1990s, was in Bosnia. Okay, so it says ethnic conflict drove the genocide in Bosnia. The end of World War I brought with it the creation of several new nations in Europe, including Yugoslavia. Circle that, Yugoslavia. That country was home to a bunch of different ethnic groups. Okay, it was home to the Serbians, who were Eastern Orthodox Christians. It was home to the Croats and Slovenes, who were Catholic. Maybe you've heard of Croatia and Slovenia. And it was also home to Muslims in Bosnia and Kosovo. So I want you to look at this map right here of Yugoslavia before 1992 on the next page there. I'm just going to read this next section to you. After the Soviet Union collapsed, so did Yugoslavia. This entire area that used to be Yugoslavia, right? Remember, it was ruled by Marshal Tito. Okay, look back if you don't remember his name. When Serbia, Slovenia, and Croatia declared independence, they each defined citizenship in terms of ethnic background and religion. Okay, so the countries we're talking about right now, just follow my cursor, right? Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia. They said that to be a part of their nation, you have to be ethnically a Slovene, a Croat, or a Serb. So this is very different from the American idea of nationalism. We say, hey, if you're a citizen, if you do it legally, you're an American, right? Doesn't matter what you look like, what your religion is, what your ethnicity is, does not matter, you're an American. In Europe, especially Eastern Europe, it's much different. You are considered not a Serbian unless you are ethnically a Serb. Same with the Croats and the Slovenes, etc. Okay? Serbian nationalists, people right here, led by demagogue Slobodan Milosevic. Circle his name in the paragraph below here. Slobodan Milosevic. They were particularly emphatic about ethnic purity. Serb forces and attempts to dominate states such as Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, right here. Okay, so Serbia is trying to control Bosnia and Kosovo. Right? They committed horrific acts of ethnic cleansing, just another term for genocide, against Muslims from Bosnia and Kosovo. They killed or drove out people who were not part of the main ethnic group of their homes. In total, more than 300,000 people in the region perished over the course of Yugoslavia's balkanization, another word to circle, or disintegration into separate states. So in 1992, when these places broke into separate states, that was called balkanization. That region is called the Balkan Peninsula, or just the Balkans. And when all these nations broke up, it created some ethnic conflicts, okay? So if you just want to write a couple things on the map here, just so you can remember, these two nations, write Catholic, okay, Slovenia and Croatia, mostly Catholic. All right, Serbia, mostly Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox. And then you had Bosnia and Kosovo, which are mostly Muslim. All right, Serbia invaded Bosnia and Kosovo and committed genocide against the people there, okay, who were not ethnic Serbs. All right, very, very sad. All right, now moving on to another genocide in Rwanda. We've already talked a little bit about this, but I just want you to circle, underline a couple things. Circle Rwanda, all right, a small nation in Africa. It was the site of one of the worst genocides in modern history. Top of the next page there talks about the Hutus and the Tutsis. Okay, they were enemy tribes, right? And the Hutus killed a bunch of Tutsis. Over the next 3 months or so, between 500,000 and 1 million civilians, mostly Tutsis and some moderate Hutus, were killed. And some sources estimate that casualties were even higher. The best estimate I've heard is 800,000. And this was just between April and June of 1994. Okay, April to June of 1994, so many people killed. And remember, I said they weren't killed with guns. They were killed with machetes. Just absolutely horrible to think about. Sudan. All right, last thing for today, Sudan. There's another genocide that erupted in 2003 in Darfur. Circle that. I think I talked about this before, that George W. Bush was the first person to call this a genocide. Down here it says the Sudanese government unleashed Arab militants known as the Janjaweed on the region. Together with Sudanese forces, the Janjaweed attacked and destroyed hundreds of villages throughout Darfur, slaughtering more than 200,000 people, mostly non-Arab Muslim Africans. More than 1 million people were displaced, creating a refugee crisis that spilled into neighboring Chad, the country of Chad. All right, so the genocide continued for quite some time. The genocides in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Sudan became stains on the conscience of the world. We thought that this era was over, and then now in the 90s and 2000s, we have more genocide taking place, right? And this was, like it said, a stain on the conscience of the world. Countries were saying, what could we have done to prevent this? Maybe we should have done more. And this is when the U.S. becomes more active in world affairs, okay? But this is seen as a failure of the international community to stop these types of crimes against humanity, okay? So let me know if you have any questions about the Iraq War or any of these other conflicts that took place at this time.